we really need to be able to find a way of them assisting each other rather than outshining or, outpacing each other, because, we do have pace current. Yeah. So just because there's a multi-year agreement that it is binding, say we're staying away, we're not voting for you anymore, that will be catastrophic for the ANC. A series of embarrassing discoveries, in the sense that, wait, not only were people aware that there was an issue here, but they actually spent resources trying to understand the issue, and then they didn't do anything about it. So it's going to be a matter of, okay, guys, why was this not addressed?
Join us in supporting the Springboks when they take on the All Blacks at Ellis Park on the 31st of August 2024. We will be hosting exclusive hospitality at the Ellis Park Arena. Our hospitality includes pre-match analysis by international rugby players, lunch, drinks, Category A tickets inside the stadium so that you can enjoy the game right there. After the match, we're going to have live music, more food, more drinks, exclusive parking. What more could you want? If you want to join us and bring any size group, get more information below this video. Welcome to the State of the Nation, driven forward by Pace Car Rental. You know that we have been looking at the Government of National Unity, and I was drawn to an article that was written by one of our regular analysts that has been on the show many times, and that is Khaya Sithole. Welcome back, Khaya. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
I saw the article that you had published in News 24 where you were talking about the bloated cabinet, which, from a cost perspective, which obviously a lot of people talk bloat, but at the end of the day, someone's got to foot the bill. You're in numbers, man. This is not going to be cheap. But you say there may be some upside to all this money that we're going to spend on this cabinet. Do you want to explain to us what your thinking is there?
Well, firstly, the president obviously decided to play political games by packing the cabinet with as many people as he could find. And I think obviously the reason you end up there is that even before you had this new arrangement, the ANC always had to try and please and placate as many of its constituencies as possible. So cabinets have been big on the basis that so many people needed to be accommodated first and foremost. And now, obviously, when you're not only trying to accommodate those within, but also the new parties and the new alliances, it was inevitable that, there'd be a headache in relation to putting this together. And I think, obviously, what has also emerged is the fact that a lot of people simply thought he was going to, do the difficult work now and say that, look, within the ANC, we obviously are going to have less people being accommodated and make the cut within the ANC. But what he then simply did is to say, well, I'll accommodate as many of the new outsiders as I need to, and then in order to still accommodate the ANC, then I'll add more. So you've got all these new deputy ministers. When people were already wondering what a first deputy minister does, now there's two of them. So it's obviously been, a political trade-off that for as long as the Constitution allows him to do so, he did do so. And inevitably, it will cost us more. There's no escaping that. And the incremental cost is obviously the difference between an ordinary MP salary versus a deputy minister's salary, because obviously that's where he's decided to do the packing up of portfolios. And then he's decided to split portfolios where sometimes the logic is not very clear about why the split, except for the fact that he simply wanted to accommodate many more people. So that's what we signed up for as voters, and they keep reminding us that if we didn't want this, we should have voted for one party, one way or another. But what is also obviously of interest is how these new ministries have been put together in a sense of, well, who is now within that previously wasn't there. So you've got some of the ministries that have been taken by the DA in particular. But what we're also seeing is that it is no longer a matter of just comrades endorsing and, supporting each other. There will be ministries where there is now not only a new set of eyes, but a set of eyes that has probably a history of skepticism and scrutiny. So people who've spent the past 10 or 15 years always scrutinizing and criticizing what emerges from these particular ministries are now in a position or within the room to be able to then listen to the deliberations. And then they can't obviously forget the source of their skepticism in the past. So we are hoping what that does is that it translates into fresh engagements, or robust engagements, and more honest engagements. And the distinction between what used to happen and what happens now is that there are instances where the way the ANC works and the way the ANC works with particular partners filters into decision making. So if you think, for example, about a matter that involves civil servants, and given the relationships that the ANC has with, particular trade unions and all of those, you kind of imagine that for 30 years they've been used to finding a meeting of the minds based on particular parameters and expectations, based on particular expectations about future electoral support. So we know that some unions have explicitly said that, look, we will endorse the ANC on the basis that they pursue a program of a particular nature. Now, obviously, in the new dispensation, it is no longer a linear conversation. It is no longer guaranteed that those who are bargaining across the table will find the ground as fertile as it used to be. So if you think, let's use, for example, basic education. So obviously, Angie has got a very strong relationship with the unions built over many, many years. And I think, to her credit, very few people find anything to credit her with. I think what you've seen in the past 10 years is that relationship has been stronger than it used to be, in the sense that you hardly ever hear about a general teacher strike, because she's obviously found a way to work with them. It may have cost us a lot, but it's probably something that she thought was the way to do things. Now, those same unions, you would remember the moment they heard that the new minister was coming from the Democratic Alliance, they were already up in arms on the basis that it is no longer someone we're familiar with. It is no longer someone that we've got a very well-established relationship. So for them, I think the anxiety was, what if this new minister starts asking difficult questions about the way we reach consensus between the unions and the ministry, and what does it mean for them? So it was not surprising that you saw them already screaming out even before she started the job, because for them it's a matter of, wait, hold on, we've built a way of doing things for the past 30 years that obviously has some benefits for us as incumbents, some benefits for us either as unions or as representative of a particular constituency. And now it sounds like those conversations are going to be ventilated anew, and we do not know if we are going to be as successful in getting our way as we've been under a particular dispensation. So that is something that I think is important for a couple of reasons, because a lot of the problems that we tend to see in the state is that the ANC has a track record of kicking matters down the can rather than confronting them, and then dealing with the very difficult questions of how it's going to be resourced and what the trade-offs are. There's many examples. If you look at the 350 Rand grant, for example, they still refuse to make a decision on what its status is. So they keep saying that just find a budget for 6 more months, 6 more months, and 6 more months. That's just one example of where they refuse to be decisive and say, okay, is this, for example, the inception of a universal basic income grant? And if so, these are the trade-offs. So they are not in the habit of making critical decisions. So now that you are obviously going to have to get the buy-in of people who are not beholden to that old way of doing things, we hope that this translates onto people making the necessary difficult decisions now, rather than deferring and hoping that by the time the next electoral cycle comes, people have either forgotten or solutions have invented themselves, which doesn't happen.
So now you talk about kicking the can down the road. There's some issues that we've been waiting for 30 years to be kicked down the road. And I think it's fair to say that any government will have, by its very definition, the government will have a conflict with unions.
Yeah.
It's almost baked in. Even union supporting governments, like the poster child being Labour Party.
Yeah, the Labour Party.
Eventually, you're going to have to confront the unions.
Yeah.
South Africa, we've been waiting for 30 years for this to break one way or another.
Yeah.
In actual fact, it hasn't overly broken in favor of the unions. They're still there and they still have too much power. But it's just like, as you say, no decision has been made. It's just like that problem has never been dealt with.
Yeah.
So some of these are going to be real legacy issues.
Yeah, I mean, look, for example, a couple of years ago, it was the courts that rescued the government, in the sense that when that multi-year wage agreement had been signed, and then Tito Mboweni said he was not going to honor it, it was completely, a shock to the system. And people are like, wait, hold on, how dare he? I mean, on what basis does he do that? And obviously, it was only when the court intervened and said, well, if the resources are limited, then the resources are limited. That's just the hard reality. But what that did on the downside is that it then made the unions and the bargaining powers much more skeptical about government for future negotiations, in the sense that they will no longer assume that just because there's a multi-year agreement that it is binding. So I think it's still emboldened them to be a bit more demanding in their list of demands, and the answer will not be, okay, it's a multi-year wage agreement, so therefore please just play it easy. That broke a long-standing consensus, and obviously it is the current ANC leaders who somehow have to navigate around that. And I think the unions are going to be even more skeptical under the next round of wage negotiations, on the basis that, well, we now know that agreements may not be honored if the government decides that resources are a limitation. We also know that our bargaining power is no longer as linear or as strong as it used to be, because we may be in an unfortunate position, for example, to be a union that has to go and bargain with a ministry that is led by someone who's not from the ANC in particular. Somebody who's going to be saying, well, actually, I'm sorry, this just doesn't work. So how do those particular unions navigate that space is going to be a very interesting one. But I think, obviously, as you rightly say, for 30 years, there have been particular political trade-offs that any political party makes in order to either protect its constituency or its voter base. And we do know that in South Africa, that conversation, that link between the ANC and the unions has been particularly strong. If you, whether you use COSATU or whatever else the case might be, that partnership has been there for a very long time. It is a partnership that is now going to be subjected to a serious test of its resilience, because if I was an ANC a minister, I would happily simply say, but it was the new government of national unity that said to me, I couldn't give you the things we used to be able to give to you. So you can get this plausible deniability that says, well, actually, we are no longer in control of the conversation, so therefore you guys must accept what is on the table, otherwise there's simply nothing that can be done. So some of them will actually even use that as a basis for saying, well, I'm sorry, my powers are not as strong as they used to be, so let's just work with what's on the table.
Yeah, and you're going to see, I was saying that you're going to see a similar thing when it comes to some of the comrades that may, in fact, end up in jail. And then they may say, but I feel very ill.
Yeah.
And in fact, this flu might be life-threatening.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the Minister of Correctional Services and get me a medical parole? And they'd say, well, speak to Meneer Groenewald.
He's the one that has to deal with the parole conversations.
Comrade, if it was up to me, I'd sign the release right now.
But also, what I highlighted in that article is that some of these additional deputy ministers or these additional layers may actually help us through the transition stage. So if you think, for example, and the basic education is a good example because of just how important that relationship between the state and the unions and for the stability of the system is. So you would imagine that the deputy minister who is now going to be working with a DA minister is someone who's still probably going to retain very strong relationships with that particular union space, which is then the responsibility may then be that you need to be able to manage that part of the relationship, because I, as a minister, do not enjoy historical relationships. I don't have strong relationships. So we need you as a deputy minister to be able to really be the bridge between the new administration and the old ways of doing things. So these may be the roles that these deputy ministers have to execute, with the understanding that it is a process that takes years to build to get to that stage where there is, a meeting of the minds that gets us across the line, even if there might be points of contention. So if these deputy ministers then regard their role as the bridge between basically old practices and old habits versus new realities, then they may actually have a very important role to play. Otherwise, you don't want to find yourself at the risk of unions threatening a general strike on the basis that, well, all these DA ministers are not listening to us and you as the ultimate government are not intervening, because there's always this trade-off about, well, who is responsible for making decisions. So you can't as the SACP or SCOSA to say, look, Mr. President, we haven't been able to reach an agreement at that level. Can you intervene? Because that creates chaos. So you don't want to end up in this stage. So we're hoping that these ministers and their deputy ministers are going to have a much clearer understanding of what the risk factors are in relation to particular sectors, and then be able to find a way of saying, well, let us actually keep the system viable. And it's not in anyone's interest to say, yes, they must strike in relation to that portfolio because we're not in charge of it as the ANC. So if there's chaos there, it's not an ANC problem. So you can't have it like that. It's still going to be a government problem. So we really need to be able to find a way of them assisting each other rather than outshining or, outpacing each other, because, we do have pace currently. Yeah. So we're hoping that that's what we see.
Yeah. So Khaya, tell me, you've worked with some of the unions, and is this now an existential crisis potentially for unions in South Africa? Because in a country with 50% unemployment, a union isn't there to protect workers from losing their jobs. A union in South African context is there to keep workers in their jobs even if they're bad.
Yeah.
That's really what it's become in South Africa.
So I've done an article a few months ago, could have been sometime last year, just talking about the very strong bargaining power of the incumbents in the workplace, in the sense that people who do have jobs and are unionized, they obviously have this very strong base that is able to bargain on their behalf. And what makes it strong is obviously the very strong alliances that it has held with the ANC in particular. So you've got this conundrum where, let's say, for example, 50% of the working age population are out of the conversation room, and 50% are represented within the conversation room. And those that are represented are then represented by unions that are trying to bargain for a better, for a better outcome for the incumbents, right? So what that does is that you have this amplified, power of incumbents, and the exclusion of the outsiders is perpetuated. And in instances where you're trying to figure out, well, what is the best solution out there for everyone, we are seeing that there are there's this exclusion from the conversation for those that don't have anyone representing them. So obviously, if you're unemployed in South Africa, you're basically a statistic. There isn't a forum that says, okay, cool, when the state is doing some forward planning for the next 3 or 5 years, what is it that we need to be able to say to express the desires and the wishes of those that are outside of the system in order for them to stand a good chance of being onboarded? So it becomes like, part of this overall conversation about somewhere along the line, the economy must turn around. And if the economy turns around, we hope that jobs will be created. And if jobs are created, we hope that we'll be able to employ people. And what we also then see as a permanent problem in the country is that if I am bargaining on your behalf, I'm actually trying to get the best outcome for you, right? I do not have the responsibility to people that I do not represent, right? So because I do not have a responsibility to people that I do not represent, I will, even if I'm aware of what, the resource limitations are, I will try to get as much and extract as much for the benefit of my constituency as I can. And obviously, at the end of the conversation, there's probably precious little left to share with those that are not represented in the room. So that's really how this relationship has worked. And of course, unions represent a constituency, and their mandate is to say, get the best deal out there for us. And obviously, in the long run, we do have this question of, well, how does the government balance this trade-off between the plight of the excluded versus, the demands of the incumbents? And what you need to be able to figure out is a way for the state to emerge from these conversations and saying, look, in relation to those that we are bargaining with, in relation to the existing workforce, this is what we've had to do. These are the trade-offs necessary. But at the end of those conversations, this is what we've then decided must be allocated to those that are excluded so that it gives them a chance of one day being inside the room. And that's something that we probably haven't perfected in the past 8 years.
We haven't even begun.
We need to do it a bit better. And I think also another follow-up is obviously the habits of yesteryear, as I call them, is that if you look at a structure like NEDLEC, for example, whatever deliberations happen there and the nature and the form of submissions and the synthesis and the ultimate deliberations and outcomes have been premised on this one party being responsible for leading the conversations. Now, perhaps in reconfiguring the state at large, you have to go back to all of those type of platforms and forums and say, well, actually, it sounds like we now need to open up the space, accommodate not only the new political alliances and new political partnerships, but perhaps new formations that historically haven't been part of this conversation so that it is as representative as possible. You can't have the state at large being run through this government of national unity, and yet these key conversational platforms that feed into state decision making, into state policy formulation, still replicating, an ANC at 60% or an ANC at 69% as it used to be. That will create a disconnect.
Yeah. And on the back of this, or certainly adding into this issue, is that we now have proof that the unions are politically impotent. Because one just has to remember in 2019 when that genius, gap-toothed wonder, Irvin Jim, decided to start his own political party. He couldn't even carry his own members.
Yeah. Right? What was it, 4,000 votes or something?
4,000
could have been more than that.
Had 300,000 members or something crazy. So it shows that politically they're not a threat. I do recall the early 90s when we went into the whole sort of CODESA talks heading towards the first election, where there was a genuine concern that COSATU at that point could have gone independently and as call it the Labour Party and been a serious challenge to the ANC at that point. Instead, they decided to throw their lot in together. Nowadays, I don't think they'd get 5% of
I mean, even if you use the most simplistic mathematics, the unions have got a registered active membership base that is, millions when you look at them collectively. And, the ANC, for example, it has less than 1 million registered members. So you can even say that, look, if these guys had decided that they want to go at it on their own, they already know that, this is what our active membership base is. We've got 1 million here or two, and we can even project how many seats we would get out there. And the question would be, well, can we run independently and then work with the ANC once we're in power? Because I think that would have given them better bargaining powers. Now, what we do know is that obviously over the 10, 15 years, there's been obviously the decline of unionization. Many more people my age probably don't even join unions even when they do work. And there's also been the decline of the unions themselves, thanks to the fragmentation that you saw, whether it was NUMSA or whether it was, emergence of SAFTU and things like that. So there's also been these problematic politics within the unions themselves, which has probably undermined the bargaining power that they used to have. And for a very long time, people would say, the one thing the ANC cannot afford to do is to piss off the unions, because if the unions say we're staying away, we're not voting for you anymore, that will be catastrophe for the ANC. Well, the unions did say they're going to vote for the ANC, and they were still catastrophe for the ANC. So I think the strength of the argument in the future won't be as strong as it used to be. And obviously the ANC now has to deliberate on, well, if these unions didn't deliver this time, can they ever deliver? And that will be important in sort of shaping the nature of the conversations that the ANC has with structures like COSATU in the future. Because if COSATU can no longer use the threat of staying away from voting for you as a primary bargaining tool, what is their bargaining tool? So you're going to have to observe these developments incrementally, obviously. My suspicion is that in the upcoming series of wage negotiations, you're probably going to end up with much of what we are used to, in the sense that we still haven't created enough alternatives and when I say alternatives, ways of doing things differently after the formation of this government of national unity. So if somebody says, let us get into wage negotiations within the next 3 months, for example, we're still probably using basically the old models. We're still using the old conversations, the basis for that. So unions may have one last chance to get very good concessions out of government. But going forward, it will be after we've had this convention that Thabo Mbeki has proposed. And obviously, I think what will emerge from that is probably a reconfiguration of all these particular interaction points between the state, the unions, and other sectors of society. And that will mean that by the time you get to the next round of negotiations, it will probably be the first proper round of negotiations after the national unity arrangement. And I think that will be very different to what we've been used to before.
And then turning our attention back to our bloated cabinet and the government of national unity, unions being one part. But there's also, I suppose, the checks and balances, the contestation within many of those departments.
Yeah.
That might be worth the money. A deputy minister who gets kept out of the loop by his minister might run straight to the State of the Nation, and we would happily have that interview where he says, I don't know, I don't get told what's going on around here. They exclude me from meetings, etc.
Yeah, that would be tragic.
Yeah.
So
for them coming on the State of the Nation would be wonderful. Oh, so not that far.
Okay. We'll see. Yeah. So I think, again, as I intimated earlier on, them working together is going to be quite important. But I think also there is the reality that this is, it's not a permanent arrangement. They still, belong to and represent their individual parties. So you're going to have to figure out a way of how a party that previously held a strong position in relation to a particular issue then finds a way of saying, well, now that we are within the room and we can see what the trade-offs and the decision-making process was, this is what we agree with and this is what we still disagree with. So, for example, the DA and the blue lights question. I mean, for as long as you're in opposition, you could say that, yes, they're wasting money, they are, plundering resources because they all have all these blue lights. And now when you get them and then somebody from the police ministry or whoever is responsible for those processes comes and says, Minister, your risk assessment report says that you need this particular level of protection because you obviously, are now a political frontline player. Would that person say, no, for 30 years we've been saying that we don't want blue lights, so never mind what that risk assessment says, I still want the blue light, I don't want the blue lights. I don't think that's going to happen. So a lot of them are now going to have to come out and say, well, actually, now that we're inside the room, this is what we understand the decision making and the rationale for this to be, and this is why we are now in favor of it. It won't be easy because everyone will be like, it's very hypocritical. But at the end of the day, they've signed up to join a government led by the ANC. So therefore, you're going to have to find a way of communicating how you sort of reach this consensus or this meeting of the minds, because you absolutely cannot retain pre-existing positions as if you're in opposition, because that will create the type of chaos that leads to people undermining each other. And I think once people undermine each other, it's very clear that that department will be paralyzed, and nobody wants that. So it will be very difficult, but it will be very necessary. And now that we've signed up for this, it is unavoidable.
Yes. And obviously we saw that quite clearly with Jacob Zuma, who was, when he was president, didn't do any of the things he says he wants to do now. He never even mentioned it. I think it was on his last day in office that he spoke about free education for the first time.
It was his last day as ANC president in Nasrec on the 16th of December 2017, where he suddenly decided that free education must be rolled out anyway. Not very clear why in the preceding 9 years when he had been in charge of the state, that hadn't been the way of doing things, particularly because it was a long-standing ANC resolution. So freeze must fall had nothing to do with it. The ANC had decided many, many years earlier that that's what they wanted to do. And when he was in power, he simply didn't implement it until, of course, it was the last throw of the dice in Nasrec, and it turned out that it didn't get him across the line in the way that he wanted to get across the line.
And now that he's freed from any responsibility whatsoever, now he can, want to change the world. And I must admit, I do have a bit of a smile whenever, and it even happened when I interviewed Tlumelo Mlela from MK, and he said, well, President Zuma was doing all of these things, and I was saying, well, I was in this country, he was doing none of them.
Or maybe he wasn't telling us about it. So it was all happening in secret. We don't know.
But the government of national unity is now there. People are settled in. Now we're starting to see an interesting dynamic. We're starting to see some of the ministers shining, or certainly being out there.
Yeah.
That holds its own. That makes the game very interesting, doesn't it? That you take a backwater ministry like Sports, Art and Culture, which most people who think about it for 10 minutes would scrap.
Yeah.
But you give it to Patriotic Alliance to keep him quiet, and it turns out that he hogs all the
the
or the
limelight.
headlines with some action in a dead department.
Yeah.
What do you think the future holds as you see it unfolding?
Look, I think obviously there was always the possibility, what do they say? A new broom sweeps
Very much cleaner, yeah.
So I think obviously somebody, again, who walks into a particular ministry without the legacy hangovers and just looks at, oh, here's a report that says 300 million rand has gone missing through cybersecurity issues. This is something that needs to be resolved. So you simply put it out there. Somebody who would have been part of the furniture for a very long time probably remembers 10 or 15 years ago why we decided not to publicize that issue. Was it a matter of we thought it was embarrassing for us as the government of the day? Was it a matter of we thought it was embarrassing for the political principal who presided over that? There can be many reasons why it wasn't done because, again, he didn't create the report as soon as he arrived. He found it there. It's information that people have been sitting on. So that's just one example. So you will see a lot of those initial, transparency, exposés that say, oh, actually, I've discovered this. So, for example, we know that in the basic education department, there's a very important report that talks about, what happens in that nexus between the unions and, the department. Many reports that have been commissioned and couldn't be released because, the unions were like, you're not going to let this see the light of day. There's a new minister who doesn't enjoy that relationship with the unions. Do you then start to seeing this being ventilated out there and then people saying, oh, actually, this is a problem, this needs to be done differently. So I think in the initial phases, it was inevitable that you're going to see that. Maybe the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, I'm actually much more interested in what the DTI would release if they had to speak about the National Lotteries Commission and how deep the rot has been in there, for example. So a person who walks in brand new and says, okay, this is a bit of an issue. I think I need to tell people that I'm addressing this. You're going to see that happening. And it's not just in those particular ministries. I think it's probably everywhere where there's a new set of eyes where people are going to be like, no, actually, the country needs to know that there's an issue and this we're addressing it or why it wasn't addressed before. So, yeah.
But now it's easy. It's relatively easy. If you came in as a minister from a non-aligned ANC party and one of the other parties, you see, as Minister McPherson saw in Public Works, there's 300 million that's been taken out of here. The report's lying there, but nobody publicizes it. Gauteng McKenzie, they gave money to their mates and now I'll just publish the list. At some point, what is do you see the ANC's response going to be to this? Because they started, it's not going to be too long. If another couple of these come out, and they all come out of the opposition benches, the ANC is going to have to counter with something. They're going to have to come out with their own exposés.
Well,
or something.
Yeah. Look, I think it's probably going to be a series of embarrassing discoveries in the sense that, not only were people aware that there was an issue here, but they actually spent resources trying to understand the issue, and then they didn't do anything about it. So it's going to be a matter of, okay, guys, why was this not addressed? And obviously, what will be a good political capital for the remaining opposition parties. I say remaining because, everybody can still sign up to this national unity thing. For the remaining political parties, they will actually use that information to say, see, these ones not only presided over a rot over many years, but you as a DA, for example, have joined them in this rot. So unless you can show us what you're doing to deal with this rot that you found in them, you are actually equally complicit. And so you see that that's going to be the rhetoric from the true opposition benches. So there's one part where you make these discoveries and then you put them out there, but then there's the bigger problem statement of what do you do about it? And obviously, if you are now the minister that says, look, I'm here to make sure that the department works well, you need to be able to then say, not only did I discover that there was this problem, this is what I'm now doing in order to address that problem. So that is, for me, much more important than just saying, hey, look at what they've been hiding. I mean, people kind of work out that there's a lot of things that are being hidden about or how things are not working well within the state. So now we need to be able to see, now that you figured it out, tell us what the solution is. And obviously, that solution may indeed be embarrassing to previous incumbents. I think you saw Patricia de Lille having to issue a response in relation to one of those discoveries, and that response didn't seem to take the matter very far because we were all like, oh, but what did you do about it? Yeah. So you're going to see that particular issue playing out. And obviously, the ANC, there will be instances where they feel compelled to respond and sort of launch some spirited defense about why they didn't do it, they're very unlikely to come up with very credible reasons for why they didn't act on things that were clearly problems identified within the state.
But I mean, it could get quite interesting if we start getting a competition going, a competition for good governance, a competition for unearthing these things, and it could end up embarrassing the ANC dramatically, especially if they're coming out with none.
Yeah, I mean, if we could, as the state of the nation, simply say to all these new ministers, if you walked in and there was an audit report that indicated that the performance of this department is XYZ, please tell us exactly how you, as a new minister, either a DA minister or an IFP minister, are going to improve on that, because you've been telling us that you could do things better, you could govern better. Well, now here's an opportunity. The Auditor General has told you what the issues are. Show us what your roadmap towards resolving those things are, because it cannot be enough for you to use a singular reference point of the province of the Western Cape to say, yeah, we do things better. And then you say, well, actually, can you show us how you would govern better when it comes to the very difficult issues around national ministries with the national landscape? And that's going to be the litmus test for them. And if they can't fix it at department level, people will be like, but we actually know how to do it at national level.
Yeah, but the obvious antidote to that, I think, is, or certain way to deal with that, is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And that is going to be that those ministers that come in from the other parties are going to have to live their lives in the open. They're going to have to publish every piece of paper that comes their way.
Yeah.
Before it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
So if, and that's what it shows to me. It's going to be very exciting for people like you, me, and everybody who's watching us, because we are going to be sitting on there saying, you can't come to us in 6 months' time and say, look, I've been trying to solve this problem.
Yeah.
No, you're going to have to do it the other way around if you're one of those ministers where you come out and you say, oh, there's a problem here, I'm telling you up front, and now we're going to try and tackle it. So it's going to be very, very interesting.
It also helps that even at the accountability level, when it comes to parliament, it's much more diverse now. So, there will be instances where people are like, no, actually, what you're saying doesn't make sense. We need you to explain a bit better. And I think if you're going to observe that the role of these portfolio committee chairs is going to be quite important, because obviously now it's going to be a matter of, it's no longer that comradely kind of, it's fine, as long as our own comrade brought it here, we will eventually support it. There might be some tentative levels of scrutiny. I think right now it's going to be very clear, hard scrutiny. And obviously, once you've come in as a minister from another party and you've told us that, oh, you're doing things differently, people are going to expect you to maintain that standard. So I think there's a lot of pressure on someone like Gauteng Mackenzie, for example, to say, yes, fine, you've shown us exactly how rotten it was when you got them, but going forward, whenever there is a call for funding, for example, the expectation is that as soon as you've approved the list of beneficiaries, you publish it, because why wait?
Now, the government of national unity got here. There were a few birth pains. There was no doubt it was quite a tough labor. But one of the standout things with the government of national unity and the arrangements, there were two standout things. One was the fight for credible cabinet posts, and then the bad taste in the mouth left over by some of the bloating of cabinet. When you create a ministry of science and technology, come on, that's just a job for a pal. It's not really doing anything. We understand that. But anyway, that's all. We've digested that. But then along comes Gauteng. What do you make of the situation in Gauteng?
I don't know if it's sustainable in the long run, because the problem that it creates the perception that Gauteng could simply tell the president, we're not doing what you decided to do at national level. And the reality here is that, the irony, I suppose, is that the ANC is even weaker in the province than it is nationally. So if at national level you're at 40% and you've been forced to work within this particular parameters, at a province where your electoral power is even less, you can reject that. It just sounds weird. And the risk is that it might leave the impression that they undermine the president. And this means that other provinces, when eventually they have to enter into similar conversations in the future, can be like, well, Gauteng was allowed to depart from the playbook, so why is it a problem if we do the same thing? And that might run the risk of undermining the sanctity of what President Cyril Ramaphosa said is put together, because this is now going to be his legacy project. I mean, forget everything else that we were hoping was going to do when he came into power in 2017 and what he threatened to do and then didn't do. This is now going to define his legacy as firstly the man who managed the transition to a time when the ANC obviously fell below 50% for the first time, and then managed to get many other parties to come across the table and say, let us actually now work on a national agenda that, caters to the national problems instead of our own individual political persuasions. And if it then spends the next 5 years at the risk of unraveling because the ANC in Gauteng has decided that, well, actually we're not bound by what the president wants ultimately out there, it does create problems because people are always going to ask, but exactly how influential was he if he couldn't convince a province that had actually had the worst electoral outcomes to simply say, no, we're not going to do it that way. And obviously the big departure point was on the allocation of cabinet posts. And the assumption that parties like the DA labored under is that basically the model that you had created at national level will be replicated in some way at provincial level. But obviously there's departure points. At national level, if the president decides that he needs 20 more cabinet members next week, we'll all be cabinet members. So there are no limitations at that level. But when it comes to provincial governments, you're basically bargaining for 10 seats at MEC level, and then you've got the other 3 seats, which is Premier, the Speaker, and the Deputy Speaker. So between those 13 seats, you now need to figure out, okay, how do we then distribute them in a manner that everybody will say, okay, this seems to reflect that spirit that has been adopted at national level, led by the president. So that is what the DA said should have been done. And then the ANC obviously said, well, actually, we kind of don't feel that's the way it should be done. And you ended up with this back and forth where it was a question of how many ministries do they, MSc posts did they want or didn't want, who said what and who didn't say what. But I think it is probably an arrangement that is too fragile to be maintained because it just...
Look, I have seen the documentation and it's pretty clear. Yeah. Right. And it's pretty clear that, this was not an outsmarting, but a deception. This was a flat out breaking of an agreement. So the real question is why? Yeah. Right. And I'm going to put my money on the fact that they're trying to hide something, because otherwise, why not at least throw the DA a bone of 2 reasonable seats or whatever that would have got them over the line? Instead, they shut them out completely, which means they don't want anybody looking inside the ANC's left with 97% of the Gauteng budget. So it's there's something brewing here. And in many ways, I suppose the government of national unity was saved by the DA not pushing it further. Yeah, I think would have absolutely killed it off completely. Yeah,
I think if the DA had been more demanding or from the president himself, it probably would have derailed it, because at some point in time you needed to be very clear that we are not putting together a DA government. Yeah, we are putting together an ANC-led, government of national unity. And I think eventually the DA sort of said, okay, we can work with this, and probably it may, well, I think we'll never know the timelines, but obviously remember there was also the last minute, was it an intervention? What was the EFF trying to do? Where they then said, look, we are willing to engage on the proviso of this. And then you saw immediately, it looked like, hey, somebody was like, guys, let's finalize this thing, because if the EFF comes with what some people do believe was a credible proposal, then you've got an issue of, well, do we need 2 more weeks in order to figure out what it all means? And I think eventually the idea was like, okay, this works for now, let us move on. But then in Gauteng, it seems that, you just couldn't get there.
It was less of a credible proposal and more of a groveling, begging document, please pick me kind of thing. But anyway, the point is that that there were things, and the situation is ongoing, and it's going to definitely play out. Yeah, you can't help get the feeling that the reason that the ANC may have walked back and allowed this to happen is that there's a part 2 that's already been agreed to, one would imagine.
I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
We're definitely going to follow that one. And Khaya, just in closing, are you hopeful on the government of national unity? Personally, do you think this thing has staying power, or do you think that it's going to be quite a bump? A bumpy's built in, but do you think it'll last the 5 years?
I think it will last for 2 years until the local government elections. And obviously, I mean, Panyaza Lesufi's argument seems to be that, look, the more power we concede to the DA administratively here, the greater the risk of them finally overhauling and decimating us in 2 years' time at the local government elections. If his proposition is true, then it means that the local government elections will indeed be the point in the major litmus test for this national government of national unity. Because if it turns out that the DA does utilize its access to power right now to leverage that onto better electoral outcomes, the ANC may then say, look, if in 2 years' time they could grow so much on the back that they are now part of, government and they're doing so well, of course, if Lesufi's theory is true, then guys, we've got 3 years to reverse this. So then you might find them saying that, no, actually, this is too much of a risk for us. But I can see it lasting for 2 years, and then the local government elections will then be the first major litmus test about its viability. At national level, the Gauteng situation, I expect it to change much sooner.
That is why we get Khaya Sithole onto the State of the Nation, because he has a man who really knows has great views and knows what's going on, and helping you to make sense of the madness that is South Africa. So please remember, State of the Nation, I hope you've subscribed to the channel. I hope you've liked this video. Pay us some money if you like. That'll also be okay. And join us. And support Pace Car Rental, because they keep us going. Khaya, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you here once again. And to everybody that joined us today, we'll see you again on the State of the Nation.